July 19th, 2026, 11:47 p.m. 9 shadow tankers, 1 straight. 61 hours later, Crimea was running out of fuel. This is the story of how Ukraine shut down the Kerch Strait without firing a single conventional weapon, without risking a single sailor, and without triggering a single international incident. This is the story of the Magura grid, and what 3 autonomous surface vessels anchored 40 kilometers from the Russian coast did to Moscow's most critical supply corridor in a single night. I'm your host at SteelHorizon, where we analyze the battles that change wars. The Black Sea in summer 2026 is not the Black Sea of 2022. It's a kill zone that Russia's admirals have learned, the hard way, to fear. Since Ukraine's naval drone campaign began reshaping Black Sea dynamics in late 2023, the Kremlin has lost capital warships, logistics, vessels, and irreplaceable infrastructure to weapons that cost a fraction of a percent of what they destroyed. By mid-2026, the Russian Black Sea Fleet's operational surface presence had contracted to a rump force hugging the eastern coast, rarely venturing beyond range of layered air defense umbrellas and coastal defense batteries. But warfare adapts. When one corridor closes, another opens. When Russian military planners in spring 2026 began calculating how to sustain Crimea's fuel reserves while their Black Sea surface routes bled under Ukrainian drone pressure, they looked north. They looked at the Kerch Strait, the narrow passage connecting the Black Sea to the Azov, roughly 4 kilometers at its tightest point, bridged overhead by the structure Ukraine had already struck twice in the preceding years. The logic seemed reasonable to whoever made the call in Moscow. Shadow tankers, vessels operating under falsified registration, obscured transponder data, and third-country flags, had become Russia's primary fuel smuggling mechanism since Western sanctions tightened. These weren't military ships. They were civilian vessels, or vessels designed to look like them, carrying diesel and crude oil through international corridors that enforcement agencies struggled to police consistently. Running them through the Kerch Strait at night, in shallow water, mixed among legitimate commercial traffic, looked like the kind of operational security that might actually hold. Ukrainian intelligence assessed otherwise. The Holovny Upravlenia Rozvidki, the GUR, Ukraine's military intelligence directorate, had been tracking the shadow fleet's evolving routing patterns since early 2026. Analysts noted the gradual northward drift of tanker traffic through the Azov approaches, the clustering of vessel movements in specific weather windows, and the suspicious regularity of nighttime transits through the Kerch Narrows. By late June, satellite imagery analysis and OSINT cross-referencing had built a picture clear enough to act on. What the GUR identified, over 3 months of patient mapping, was not just a route. It was a schedule. Russian logistics coordination is, for all its dysfunction on the ground, methodically predictable at the operational level. The shadow tanker convoys followed timing patterns that correlated with specific fuel demand cycles in Crimea, cycles tied to military consumption rates, power generation schedules, and heating season stockpile preparations. Understanding the demand told you when the supply had to move. Understanding the constraints of the Kerch Passage, tidal windows, traffic management protocols, the shallow northern approach channel, told you exactly when the vessels would bunch up. By the second week of July 2026, GUR analysts had mapped a specific 72-hour window, July 18th through July 21st. 14 vessels were queued for northbound transit, the largest single coordinated shadow fleet movement since the war began. If you were going to hit the supply chain, this was the moment. This was the choke point. This was the target. Which weapon was deadlier in this operation? The Magura V5 maritime drone, the Robo-Boat launch platform, or the satellite intelligence that made targeting possible? Comment your answer below. A for Magura, B for Robo-Boat, or C for intelligence. The challenge was the delivery method. Ukrainian maritime drone operators had spent the first half of 2026 contending with an evolving Russian electronic warfare problem. Russia's coastal EW systems, deployed in layered configurations along the Crimean coastline and aboard several remaining surface vessels, had learned to detect and disrupt drone control signals coming from fixed coastal launch points. The geometry was the problem. A drone launched from a known fixed position generates a predictable signal origin that Russian EW systems could characterize, track, and ultimately jam. Early 2026 operations had seen a measurable increase in drone mission failures attributable to EW disruption in the final approach phase. The GUR's response was architectural, not technical. Rather than trying to defeat Russian EW systems with better electronics, Ukrainian planners rethought the geometry entirely. What if the launch point wasn't fixed? What if the launch point was 40 kilometers offshore, mobile, and autonomous? The concept was clean. 3 Marichka-class autonomous surface vessels. Ukraine's domestically developed Robo-Boats, roughly 7 meters in length, equipped with radar, optical sensors, and encrypted satellite communications, were pre-positioned in the northern Black Sea at coordinates selected to minimize detection probability while maximizing Magura V5 strike range to the Kerch approach channels. Each vessel carried 4 Magura V5 drones in ready launch configuration for a total grid payload of 12 strike-capable naval drones. The Marichka boats themselves were not new. Ukraine had deployed autonomous surface vessels in Black Sea operations since 2023, progressively refining their capabilities through operational experience. What made this deployment different was scale and coordination. 3 boats, 12 drones, 1 pre-planned target matrix, synchronized to activate on a single trigger signal from the GUR Operations Center in Kyiv. I spent considerable time going through the available documentation on the Magura V5 platform, and one technical detail kept pulling my attention. The drone's propulsion system is optimized not for maximum speed, but for minimum acoustic signature in the final approach phase. At low speeds, under 4 knots, the Magura's electric drive is nearly silent. In a busy shipping channel at night, against the background noise of commercial vessel engines, that matters enormously. The Magura V5 is worth understanding in detail because the weapon's design philosophy reveals a lot about how Ukraine has approached the entire naval drone campaign. The platform measures roughly 5 meters in length, displaces approximately 200 kilograms fully loaded, and carries a warhead in the 300-kilogram range packed into a hydrodynamic hull designed for low radar cross-section. It's not trying to be invisible. In calm conditions, it can be spotted visually at close range. What it's trying to do is arrive fast enough from an unexpected vector that by the time it's visible, it's already inside the decision response timeline. At full speed, the Magura V5 can exceed 40 knots. That's roughly 74 kilometers per hour. A vessel crew that detects a Magura at 300 meters has approximately 15 seconds to respond before impact. In practice, at night, against a non-military crew that wasn't expecting to be targeted, the window is effectively 0. Stay with me, because what unfolds in the next phase of this operation represents a level of maritime coordination that Ukraine had never previously achieved at this scale. The targeting matrix for the July 19th operation was built from multiple intelligence streams. Satellite imagery had confirmed the presence of 8 vessels in the approach queue by 9 p.m. local time. OSINT analysts tracking vessel transponder data, including spoofed AIS signals that several shadow tankers were broadcasting, had cross-referenced the vessels against a database of suspected shadow fleet operators compiled over 18 months. 3 additional vessels, not broadcasting any transponder data, were identified through synthetic aperture radar imagery from a partner nation satellite pass conducted at 7:30 p.m. 14 vessels in total. The GUR Operations Center built individual targeting solutions for 11 of them. The 3 without reliable position fixes would be monitored, but not initially targeted. The operational goal was not to sink vessels. Sinking a civilian-flagged tanker in international approaches to a major strait, regardless of what it was actually carrying, would create diplomatic complications that the operations architects wanted to avoid. The goal was propulsion denial. A disabled vessel is not a sunken vessel. It cannot transit. It blocks the channel for others. And it creates exactly the kind of traffic disruption that cascades through a logistics system already operating near its elastic limit. How many vessels did Ukraine disable or turn back in this operation? A 6B-9C-11? The answer is coming at the end of this analysis. At 11:02 p.m. on July 19, 2026, GUR satellite analysts confirmed that the lead vessel in the convoy, a 185-meter tanker operating under a Palau flag of convenience, had entered the northern approach channel of the Kerch Strait. Transit speed approximately 9 knots. Estimated time to the narrowest point of the strait, 28 minutes. The activation signal went out from Kyiv at 11:09 p.m. 40 kilometers northwest of the Kerch Strait, The 3 Marichka boats received the signal simultaneously. Autonomous systems ran pre-launch diagnostic cycles. Sensor arrays scanned the surrounding water surface for unexpected contacts. Finding none, the boats began their pre-programmed launch sequences. Wave 1, 4 Magura V5 drones, targeting the lead tanker and 3 vessels queued behind it in the approach channel. Launch window 11:11 p.m. to 11:14 p.m. The drones dropped from their deck mounts, hit the water, and accelerated toward their approach headings on electric drive. Quiet, dark, running at roughly 8 knots to preserve their approach window. At this speed, from the launch point, they would reach the outer edge of the Kerch approach zone in approximately 2 hours. The transit was timed to arrive during the deepest part of the night cycle. Wave 2. 5 additional Magura V5 drones, targeting 5 vessels further back in the convoy queue, was scheduled to launch at 12:30 a.m. Staggered to avoid the possibility of Russian EW assets getting oriented on the launch source before the first wave completed its mission. What nobody had anticipated was the obstacle that nearly compromised the entire first wave before it reached its targets. At 12:15 a.m., approximately 40 minutes into Wave 1's transit, a Russian Coast Guard patrol vessel, a Sobol-class boat operating out of the Kerch port facility, executed an unscheduled patrol sweep along the northern approach channel. This was not in the GUAR's predictive model. The vessel was operating without running lights, suggesting it was conducting what Russian planners apparently considered a security patrol, possibly in response to general alerting about increased Ukrainian drone activity. The Marichka control team monitoring the operation's progress tracked the patrol vessel's movement in real time via satellite. For 11 minutes, the patrol boat's course intersected with the predicted path of 2 of the Wave 1 drones. If the patrol boat maintained its heading, it would be close enough to potentially detect the incoming Maguras acoustically or visually. The control team had 2 options: abort the affected drones and reduce the strike package, or execute a course alteration that would add transit time but move the drones around the patrol boat's position. They chose the course alteration. Both drones adjusted heading, adding approximately 18 minutes to their approach time and arriving at their target solutions with reduced fuel margin, but intact and undetected. The patrol boat completed its sweep and returned to port at 1:40 a.m., unaware it had come within 300 meters of 2 armed naval drones in transit. At 2:03 a.m., Wave 1 reached the outer edge of the target zone. The lead Magura V5 acquired its primary target, the Palau-flagged tanker, which had slowed to 4 knots as it navigated the approach channel's tighter geometry, and executed its terminal attack run. The drone accelerated to attack speed, approximately 35 knots in the final approach phase, and impacted the vessel's stern section at 2:07 a.m., striking the propulsion housing approximately 2 meters above the waterline on the port side. The explosion was significant enough to be captured on imagery from 2 separate satellite systems in overhead passes. It was not enough to sink the vessel. The Magura's warhead, in the configuration used for propulsion denial strikes, detonates with a shaped charge pattern designed to destroy the propeller and shaft assembly while minimizing the risk of hull breach below the waterline. The tanker's propulsion system failed completely. The vessel began to drift. Subscribe to SteelHorizon if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because what happened next in the Kerch Strait is something military planners will be studying for the next 20 years. The second Magura V5 struck a 210-meter vessel running under a Cameroon flag of convenience at 2:11 a.m. Same targeting methodology: propulsion housing, port side stern, shaped charge detonation. The vessel's engine room flooded partially. Emergency generators activated. The crew began emergency anchor deployment to prevent the disabled vessel from blocking the channel approach. They failed to anchor before the vessel drifted into the channel's shallow water boundary. The tanker ran aground on a sandbar at the channel's eastern edge at 2:34 a.m. By 2:30 a.m., the 3rd and 4th Magura V5 strikes had been executed. One was a clean propulsion kill. The 4th drone, running on reduced fuel margin from the course alteration maneuver, suffered a guidance system anomaly in the terminal phase and struck its target vessel off-center, impacting the hull above the waterline rather than the propulsion housing. The vessel was damaged but remained mobile. Its crew immediately reversed course and began emergency transit back toward open water, abandoning its position in the convoy queue. Wave 2 launched at 12:30 a.m. as planned and arrived in the target zone at approximately 3:45 a.m., by which point the approach channel was already in chaos. 2 disabled vessels were drifting. 1 was aground. Russian Coast Guard and maritime authority vessels were maneuvering in the channel, trying to establish coordination. The civilian vessel traffic that had been using the northern approach, legitimate commercial shipping with no connection to the Shadow Fleet, was halted on emergency instruction from the Kerch Maritime Traffic Control Authority. Wave 2 targeted 5 vessels further back in the convoy queue, vessels that had not yet entered the approach channel and were holding at anchor in the waiting area approximately 8 kilometers north of the strait entrance. These were softer targets geometrically, vessels at anchor in relatively open water, not in a constrained channel. But the psychological effect of the first wave had already created operational disruption independent of the drone's physical impact. 2 of the 5 targeted vessels had cut their anchor lines and were maneuvering to increase distance from the approach zone when the Wave 2 drones arrived. If you believe tactics win wars, type SteelHorizon in the comments. The operational picture at 4:30 a.m. on July 20th, 2026, as the GUR Operations Center assembled its battle damage assessment, showed the following. 4 vessels definitively disabled by propulsion-kill strikes, with 2 of those now blocking navigable portions of the approach channel. 1 vessel aground, 1 vessel damaged but mobile, currently in retreat. 3 additional vessels from Wave 2 struck. 2 with propulsion kills, 1 with a partial hit that caused significant damage but did not immediately immobilize the vessel. That vessel's crew declared an emergency and requested maritime assistance, which effectively removed it from operational consideration regardless of its mobility. 9 vessels disabled, turned back, or removed from operational capability. 5 vessels from the original 14-vessel queue were unaffected, either not in the strike package due to positioning uncertainty or not reached before the Marichka boats expended their drone complements. The Kerch Strait northern approach channel was functionally closed. The 2 disabled vessels in the channel required maritime salvage operations before any transit could resume. The grounded vessel added a navigational hazard that would persist until reflotation. Russian maritime authorities, facing these realities alongside the chaotic overnight communications traffic from the remaining convoy vessels, issued a navigational warning closing the northern approach at 5:20 a.m. on July 20th. What strikes me most about this operation is not the technical achievement, though it was substantial, but what it reveals about how Ukrainian strategic thinking has changed. By mid-2026, Ukraine had moved beyond reactive warfare. The GUR operation against the Kerch convoy was the product of months of patient intelligence accumulation, architectural planning that solved a known EW problem through geometry rather than technology, and operational patience that waited for exactly the right convoy to achieve maximum strategic disruption. This was not improvisation. This was doctrine. Here's the controversial take. Russia's Shadow Fleet vulnerability was not primarily a logistics failure. It was an intelligence failure. Moscow's planners genuinely believed that civilian vessel registration, nighttime transits, and mixed commercial traffic would provide operational cover sufficient to prevent interdiction. They were wrong. And they were wrong because they underestimated the patience and analytical capacity of Ukrainian intelligence. The GUR didn't attack the Shadow Fleet when it became visible. The GUR waited until it could be decisive. The Russian response to the Kerch closure was, predictably, bureaucratic. Official statements described a temporary technical incident requiring maritime safety assessment. Russian state media reported navigational restrictions due to vessel maintenance operations. What they didn't report was the cascade effect already developing in Crimea's fuel supply chain. The Kerch crossing remained closed for 61 hours. During that window, no meaningful fuel shipments reached Crimea via the maritime shadow route. The overland alternatives. The Kerch Bridge itself, with its constrained vehicle capacity and ongoing structural assessment requirements after previous strikes, and the rail corridor through Russian-occupied Zaporizhia, could not absorb the volume that the maritime route had been carrying. Ukrainian sources estimated that Crimea's operational fuel reserves fell to critical levels within 4 days of the interdiction. What does critical mean here? Ukrainian General Staff assessments, shared with partner intelligence services, suggested that by July 24, 2026, Russian military fuel stockpiles in Crimea had dropped to levels that would constrain air defense system operations within approximately 72 hours. The S-400 batteries defending Sevastopol require significant fuel for their power generation systems. Radar systems require continuous power. A fuel crisis is, in operational terms, an air defense crisis in slow motion. Intercepted Russian communications from the period. Fragments shared by Ukrainian intelligence services with select European partners showed logistics officers scrambling to prioritize military fuel allocation over civilian needs. Civilian fuel rationing was implemented in at least 3 Crimean administrative districts by July 22nd. Russian commanders in Crimea were sending urgent requests to mainland logistics chains for emergency resupply by whatever means available. What would NATO have done differently in planning this interdiction? The alliance's doctrine emphasizes combined arms synchronization at a scale Ukraine cannot replicate. But Ukraine's Kerch operation arguably achieved greater precision with fewer assets than a NATO planning staff would have required. Comment your analysis below. The Robo-Boat concept itself. Autonomous surface vessels as mobile drone launch platforms deserve specific attention as a doctrinal development because it solves a problem that every navy operating in contested coastal environments will eventually face. Fixed launch infrastructure is targetable. Mobile launch infrastructure is much harder to destroy, particularly when the launch platform carries no crew. The Marichka boats that executed the July 19th operation didn't return to a fixed port after the mission. They transited to a pre-planned recovery position and were retrieved by a civilian support vessel operating under commercial cover in international waters. The entire operation, from activation signal to drone recovery, generated no detectable signature at any Ukrainian military installation. Russian intelligence would have known an operation occurred. Characterizing the origin with confidence would have been a different problem. One detail from this operation I keep returning to is the fuel margin calculation on the 2 diverted Wave 1 drones. The course alteration around the Russian Coast Guard patrol added 18 minutes of transit time and consumed fuel reserves that were already at planned minimums for the mission profile. The drones made it to their targets. But if the patrol boat had been 2 kilometers closer to the original track, or if the diversion had been even slightly more aggressive, those 2 drones would have run dry before reaching the target zone. The margin was 12 minutes of fuel. 12 minutes between a clean operation and a significantly reduced strike package. That is how close precision operations often actually are. Not the version where everything works exactly as planned, but the version where careful preparation and clear decision-making under pressure squeeze through a window that is, in retrospect, terrifyingly narrow. Put yourself in the position of the Marichka control team operator who made the course alteration call. It's 12:15 a.m. You have 2 drones in potential detection range of an unplanned patrol vessel. You have 4 more drones in Wave 2 that haven't launched yet. You have 11 minutes to decide. What do? The operator diverted. The drones made it. 9 vessels disabled. 61 hours of straight closure. Crimea in a fuel crisis. That's the operational consequence of one correct decision under pressure, made by an operator who understood the margin they were working with and chose accordingly. The tactical lessons of the Kerch interdiction operate on multiple levels. At the technical level, the operation demonstrated the viability of autonomous surface vessel platforms as mobile forward launch bases, a capability that will shape naval drone doctrine globally. The geometry insight that changing the launch origin disrupts electronic warfare targeting more effectively than improving the drone's own EW resistance, is a finding that will appear in military doctrinal literature for years. At the strategic level, the operation showed that a state without a conventional surface fleet can execute effective maritime interdiction at a choke point if it has superior intelligence, patient operational planning, and willingness to develop novel delivery architectures. Ukraine did not match Russia ship for ship. Ukraine didn't need to. At the campaign level, the Kerch interdiction shows a maturation in Ukrainian operational thinking about the relationship between maritime strikes and strategic effect. Earlier naval drone operations targeted vessels and infrastructure directly. The Kerch operation targeted a logistics flow, the entire supply corridor, rather than individual assets within it. By disabling 9 vessels in the approach zone rather than sinking 1 vessel in open water, Ukrainian planners created a disruption effect that was multiplicative rather than additive. A single sunk vessel is replaced. A 61-hour straight closure cascades through an entire supply system. Real tactics. Real consequences. SteelHorizon. The answer to the quiz from earlier. How many vessels did Ukraine disable or turn back in the July 19th operation? The answer is B, 9 vessels. 4 were struck by Wave 1 drones with propulsion kills or significant damage. 1 ran aground as a secondary effect of propulsion loss. 3 were struck by Wave 2 drones. 1 was damaged by a partial hit and declared a maritime emergency, removing it from operational capability. 9 vessels from the original 14-vessel convoy queue were effectively removed from the transit window, a 64% interdiction rate against a target set that had been optimized for conventional approach evasion. Now, the questions this operation leaves open. Was the decision to disable rather than sink the correct tactical choice? The propulsion kill approach minimized ecological risk and diplomatic exposure while achieving channel closure through the secondary effect of multiple disabled vessels blocking the approaches. A sinking strategy might have affected fewer vessels per drone expended, while creating greater international incident risk. The GUR chose disruption over destruction. In the context of 2026's diplomatic environment, where Ukraine continues to seek Western military support that could be jeopardized by operations perceived as escalatory, that choice appears sound. Reasonable analysts disagree. Could Russia have prevented this operation? In theory, yes. More aggressive maritime patrol of the approach corridors, genuine operational security rather than the complacent nighttime transit assumption, and more effective monitoring of the autonomous surface vessel threat category that Ukraine had been demonstrating for over 2 years could each have reduced the operation's effectiveness. That Russia's planners chose to route 14 vessels through the Kerch approaches in a single 72-hour window, creating exactly the concentrated target package the GUR needed, reflects either overconfidence or analytical failure, possibly both. What would you have done differently if you'd been planning Ukraine's response to the Shadow Fleet routing? The GUR waited 3 months before acting. Some analysts argue that earlier, smaller-scale interdiction operations would have denied Russia the ability to build up the convoy queue that made the July 19th operation so impactful. Others contend that patience produced a decisive single engagement rather than a series of marginal disruptions. The debate over when to strike versus when to wait is as old as strategic warfare. The GUR made its choice. The result speaks for itself. Comment NEXTOPERATION below if you want our deep dive into what comes after the Kerch closure, because the follow-on moves in this campaign are already developing, and they're going to reshape the Black Sea picture heading into 2027. The Kerch Strait is not quiet in July 2026. Russian salvage vessels are still working on the disabled tankers as this script is recorded, 4 days after the operation. The grounded vessel remains on the sandbar, a steel monument to the limits of an assumption. The assumption that civilian cover, darkness, and shallow water would be enough to protect a supply corridor that Ukraine had already demonstrated it could reach. They were wrong. The Magura drones found them anyway. The Robo-Boats held their position 40 kilometers offshore and delivered their payload without a single Ukrainian life at risk. The GUR analysts who spent 3 months mapping that convoy schedule never saw the strait from any position closer than a satellite image. And 9 shadow tankers learned that modern warfare reaches further than Moscow thought, farther than any fleet, farther than any shore-based defense. Subscribe to SteelHorizon, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Kerch Strait is quieter than usual tonight, but the wrecks remain, and wreckage doesn't lie.